Hey everyone, how are you feeling today? Sean, just give me a second to get in place. I'm very grateful to be here this afternoon, and I want to jump right in just by introducing our two speakers today. Mas Masumoto is an organic peach and grape farmer and the author of 11 books while maintaining a farm. A feature documentary, Changing Season, on the Masumoto family farm was nationally broadcast by PBS in May 2016. He is currently a columnist for the Fresno Bee and the Sacramento Bee. He was a Kellogg Foundation Food and Society Policy Fellow. His writing awards include Commonwealth Club Silver Medal, Julia Child Cookbook Award, and the James Clavell Literacy Award, and a finalist in the James Beard Foundation Awards. Previously, he served as the chair of the Public Policy Institute of California, as a board member of the James Irvine Foundation, and as a former chair of the California Council on the Humanities Board. In 2013, then President Obama appointed Masumoto to the National Council on the Arts, and he served on the board for the National Endowment for the Arts. And our artist for the afternoon, Patricia Wakida is a writer, artist, and bibliophile. Her artistic education began with an apprenticeship in Japanese papermaking in Mino Gifu Prefecture in 1996, followed by an apprenticeship at the Arts and Crafts Press under linoleum block artist and letterpress printer Yoshiko Yamamoto in Berkeley, California. She is a Yonsei Japanese-American artist, writer, and community historian. Her work can be read in the Densho Encyclopedia, Discover Nikkei, and the Nichibe weekly newspaper. She is also one-third of the leadership behind Yonsei Memory Project and recently joined the Topaz Museum board. So my role as moderator is normally to make sure that the conversation keeps going, but with the most charming farmer in California and the most decorated block print artist in California, my role is actually much harder today because I have to rein things in, and we sadly only have an hour. So I'm going to cut myself short and ask for a round warm of applause for the author and artist behind Secret Harvest, Mas Masumoto and Patricia Wakida.
Okay, great.
Check.
Oh, is that your rock?
Yeah, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Do I go ahead and talk?
Yeah, go
okay. Well, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed that film that gave you an overview of the book in different ways. And it was a fun project to work on because in many ways, as a writer, you work in solitude, you work by yourself, and then you print the book later. And you're probably, if you're fortunate, starting to work on another project. All right, so the film was a way of coming back and started rethinking how to tell these stories and how the stories would start fitting together in certain patterns. And one of the things that I thought of a lot with the film was this whole notion of how I work. And let me read a little section from Secret Harvest. I farm with ghosts. They live in our fields. Each peach tree has the pruning scars from generations who worked these orchards. Every vine has been shaped by hands of workers who returned each year to add their touch to the sculpture. People and their families have etched their marks on my farm. I too hope to leave behind a simple signature on the seemingly ordinary landscapes ghosts inhabit this land and our family history. I like the idea of thinking about the work that I do revolving around ghosts, because ghosts, there is an image of ghosts as being something that you're afraid of, that are scary, but I actually think they're more like ancestors. They're with us on the farm. I still walk the fields with my grandmother, who passed away many years ago. I worked the same trees I planted with my dad in 1968 when I was an impatient teenager. And the reason why I know that is I would often hurry when I planted the trees, and they weren't exactly straight in the row. In fact, now you could see where I have to go around a tree that I did not plant correctly back then, and I live with those ghosts all the time. And my daughter and our son, who will be working on the farm, will live with these ghosts too. So I have no problem with that. Maybe it's a way that they could remember me in that respect. But as the film talked about, this all started with a phone call. And it was a phone call from a funeral home. And let me explain that a little. Shizuko was living in an assisted care center. She had suffered a stroke. As part of her care that she had a small contract for a funeral home to take care of her. Right? Now, this is all before any of us had gotten any contact with her. This funeral home had this wonderful lady named Renee Johnson, and she said, I don't want Shizuko to die alone. So she started going through records to trying to find family of Shizuko. And she went to the 1930 census, and it had the Sugimoto family listed on that. And on it was Shizuko Sugimoto and Carol Sugimoto, my mom. Not Masumoto, of course, because she wasn't married then. The way that got connected was when my dad passed away, I wrote the obituary. And there was a tradition in writing obituaries that you put maiden names in parentheses. Takashi Joe Masumoto was married to Carol, parentheses, Sugimoto Masumoto. That's how this woman from the funeral home located my mom, because of this obituary. So she gave a phone call and left the message that saying, this is Renee from Wild Rose Funeral Home, and I need to talk to you about your aunt, Shizuko. And I said, wait a minute, I don't have an aunt, Shizuko. And is this really a come on for me to buy an early package? And I thought of that for the longest time. And then, so I phoned her back, and she goes, no, I had this 1930 census. So I went to go visit her. And when I was visiting her, I saw this census. She had done this work. And I said, well, who is Shizuko? She's your aunt. I said, she can't be, because we know all of our family. And she goes, no, go visit her at the assisted care center. So I went to go meet her at the assisted care center. She was comatose, unconscious at that time. And on her door, there was a sign that said Miss Sugi, because that was her nickname they gave her. So I talked with the people there, the authorities, and the idea was that she had arrived there probably about 15 years earlier, and they thought there was no family there. That was part of Miss Sugi's family. So I talked with a regional center health worker, and they could trace back these records, and these pieces fell together. And that began this journey into trying to find this mystery. And I call it a mystery as opposed to a problem. A long time ago, a Buddhist minister was talking to me, and he said, life is a mystery to be lived, not a problem to be solved. And that stuck with me all through my life. And it was part of this journey that I went on to try to put together these pieces of this mysterious Aunt Shizuko. It was a mystery that I had to do. And one of the biggest challenges was not to add judgment. Not to say, what was the matter with them back in 1925 when she got meningitis? Why didn't they do something during World War II? But the idea was, when you look at a mystery, you're trying to piece together the past without making judgments about it. And of course, what was life like when you were in 1925, your parents did not speak English, you had alien registration cards, you were poor, you also lived in rural America. You did not get the same health treatment that other people did. And that's why Shizuko had no health when she got meningitis. And then meningitis, from what I understand, it caused the inflammation of the brain, and it starts killing part of the brain. So she stopped developing intellectually at that moment. But the family took care of her through the Great Depression. And then, of course, World War II came, and there was this another challenge that they had to have. And one of the dynamics that I really worked with, too, was, of course, I wasn't there at that moment. So how do you put together the past when you don't have all the facts? Well, the idea is you have to use your imagination. You have to understand that part of putting together family stories is to use emotions. And I thought, no, that's not how historians work. That's absolutely wrong. Because history is written by those who usually have the power to write history. My grandparents were illiterate. Does that mean their history doesn't count? Our family tended to be not storytellers. They were very quiet, stoic. Does that mean their story doesn't count? So you have to start putting in ideas of emotions and imagination, not to make up things. And believe me, as I was writing this, I started thinking, this would work so much better if I was a novelist. Because I could fill in the stories. I could fill in that emotion of Shizuko going through the trauma of growing up with a disability. I could fill in the emotions, and I could say, maybe this could be some type, like my parents had a historical romance that would be involved with this. And I realized that I'm a bad novelist. All right? When I left for college and came back to the farm, for a little time, I thought I'd be a poet. So I started writing these poems about farming life and rural life, and they ended up sounding like bad country western songs. She took my heart and stomped on it. I was bad. So that's why I tended to keep with writing what I call creative nonfiction, where you stick with the facts but also try to add other elements to that, And with that also came this whole dynamic of looking at the world through a different lens. So I would take something that was very common to our farm and try to explain the story behind it. And I brought a piece of the farm with me. All right, this is hardpan rock. Okay, who raised their hand? Do you know what this rock is? Yeah, wonderful. Okay, great. And with it, I can see hands raised and shaking heads. All right, this rock is a pain in the ass. All right, it's really not a rock. Right? It's really the soil that got squished, minerals started collecting in layers, and all moisture got evaporated out of it. It lines certain parts of the entire West Coast. Right? It's in LA, it's certainly in the San Joaquin Valley. How many of you had family that farmed? Raise your hands, okay? Or how many were willing to admit you had family that farmed, right? They know hardpan rock. They know it, both as in terms of a symbol, but also literally. My dad, when he took a huge gamble and bought our farm right after the war in 1948, he bought this piece of land because it was cheap. Why was it cheap? In the middle of the farm, in our 40 acres, we called it the hill. And it really wasn't a hill, it was a mound of hardpan rock. And he spent years clearing that. He used dynamite to blow it up to get that rock out of there. When I was a kid growing up, I would see a box of dynamite sitting on top of this stand, and I was told never to touch it. Of course, I tried to get up there, but I couldn't, Anyway, and the reason why I brought this too is I wanted to give it to certain folks as a gift. And one of those folks is Sean. Sean's grandfather was a neighbor. Sean's grandfather worked this rock. This is part of who your character is, Sean. Now, I don't know if that's a compliment or not, but this is part of Sean's legacy, this hardpan rock. Right? And for those of you who might be interested and want to admit that, my wife and my son, we have hardpan rocks for you. So afterwards, we'll have some. Go to them, Marcy, and raise your hand, and they'll give you a gift from our farm. All right. This is part of your legacy. All right. And this is part of who you are that defines our character. This rock defines Sean's grandfather. His grandfather was one of those that I interviewed in that oral history. Stoic man, but you could tell he understood this rock. If I had a better grasp of Japanese, I think he would have then told me all the swear words he would use about this rock, but he was too kind and gentle to share that with me on that, you know. But it is part of our history, and it's part of the gift that I could share with you, part of the gift that I hope that you could take home with you too. So I'm going to pause here. Patricia's going to continue, and then I'll come back and finish a few things. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us. Do I have to turn this thing on?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Sean. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and thank you to JANM for inviting Mas and I to come here to do our Southern California book launch. The book has just come out, so we're just ecstatic that you could be here to help us get this out into the world. So my name is Patricia Wakida, and I am a fourth-generation Japanese-American historian specializing in community stories, as Sean read. But I'm also an artist, and a lot of people don't know that about me since they usually see me in the context of doing the history work and the writing. But my medium of choice, very specifically, is linoleum block carving and letterpress printing. Okay, the one thing I did not practice with Elizabeth was changing the slides. Elizabeth, changing of the slides. Do I change my own slides?
Hold, please. Quick tech, figuring out some tech.
I know. We had all this time, too. We just kind of messed around. I can just talk. All right. Well, I'm just going to talk then.
We can describe
We can
what's
describe
happening.
what's
We can
happening
what's
here.
happening.
The slides I was going to show you was just a little bit about the process. Elizabeth, I have a quick question. How do I change the slides? It's probably not on. I bet that's my problem. Okay. Top one. Top and point that way. Okay. So as I was describing that, my medium of choice is linoleum block carving. So really the process of this is that I do a drawing onto something called linoleum, which is a linseed oil that's been compressed, and carve it using those very sharp tools that you see there. And I love using letterpresses. My new friend right here knows all about this. This is a Vandercook press over here where the block is locked in and it inks it over and runs the paper over it. So I can make many, many, many copies of this. Even though this isn't exactly the traditional Japanese way of doing it, it has roots in Japanese wood block printing. So that's something that's always been a part of my practice and very dear to me. This way, this way. Got it? Dame? Okay. So in 2018, the writer and organic farmer Mas Masumoto invited me to work on this very personal story about family separation and community shame, is what I would call it. We both grew up in the shadow of the shadows cast by World War II, and those concentration camps, and both of us have dedicated our lives to interpreting a lot of those stories into the next generations. And we're both from the Central Valley. My family's based in Fresno, and it's actually not that terribly far from their farm. Like, they're sort of on the outskirts of Fresno as well. I will get this. So with the aid of historical research, so I, of course, listened and read his pieces, but I also went to his house and looked at a lot of photographs, and we also had a camp in common. My family also went to Gila River, which is where I met Sean the first time, by the way, at Gila River. Did a lot of research about those kinds of things, and then I created 34 linoleum block prints for Secret Harvest. I will jokingly tell you that in the beginning, Mas's manuscript was much shorter, and he said, well, we just need a few, like maybe 8 or 10, and it doesn't have to be an illustration for every chapter. Well, then the book grew in terms of length, in terms of the number of chapters, and then he was like, yeah, we do really want one per thing. And that was a great challenge for me, because I will tell you, some of the chapters weren't that super obvious in terms of what kind of visual symbolism really best illustrates what he's conveying, what's the message, what's the story here. But I did work very hard and closely with his manuscript, and I will tell you that Mas also sometimes changed his writing based on the imagery that I came up with as I was inspired by what he was writing. So I just wanted to say in terms of the process that soon after we started, because there was a lot of tools and imagery that I wasn't that familiar with, I started making some trips out to the Masumoto farms, and unlike a lot of his other books, which focus on the stone fruits, there's a lot of storytelling in here about the grapevines, or maybe I purposely chose to think about the grapevines a lot. So I asked him to show me some of the tools that might be used for harvesting. So this very curved blade for the grape picker was of great interest to me. He had a horrible story about an accident on the farm that happened with this tool and kids fooling around with them. But also demonstrated it being, this is how you still today, correct? Harvest the grapes. You got to do each one by hand using this kind of tool to cut a very tough vine. And then we went through the process of the raisin drying, which is what Masumoto farms mostly produce from those grapes. I'm sorry. So there's a completely traditional form of drying the raisins by putting them on paper in between the rows and honestly just letting the sun dry them out to the right sugar content and rolling them once it's ready. Even if it's a rainy day and rain comes in, there's moisture, it's going to threaten those raisins. They're out there rolling up all those papers one at a time through acres and acres of raisins, which is the way it's always been done. So from these photographs, I was then able to create some drawings, which became the blocks. Which, by the way, I'm horrified to look at it this large. They were always meant to be very small. Like, if you look at the book, they're very tiny, and I'm looking at this and going, oh my God, that's a mistake. It's terrible, like, who did that? So, and then here's another example where I forced my husband and my son, Sam, some of you guys who are from the museum recognize my husband, Sam, who used to work in media arts department. And my son Takumi, and I was like, I really want to do the thing here on Tankobushi, but I want you guys to go in there with real shovels. And they're wearing their hoppy coats, right? So there they are, and that became this block, which in the book you'll see that's the actual block. Everything in linoleum also is the mirror image of what's printed because it'll get inked and it's printed and it's backwards. So, and Masa was joking that all the people that I used as models in my book were not paid. So the final thing, illustration I want to just kind of go through some process was the image that's on the cover of Shizuko. So the first important thing is that before Mas met his auntie Shizuko, there were no extant photographs of her as a child or a young adult or even middle. He'd only met her in the 90s when she was much older. So I had to kind of use my imagination to see what would Shizuko look like, kind of based on what she looked like in her older years. But more importantly, for historical purposes, we talked about how women at that time would have worn these sunbonnets to protect their faces from the sun, but also from scratchiness, from bugs, for anything that's gonna, impact your face and your skin, including the arms. And this one on the right is actually a photograph of women in Hawaii, Japanese women in Hawaii who were collecting sugarcane, which I know was very sharp and was really difficult to harvest. But there's this very common kind of bonnet that were often made out of rice, recycled rice flour bags and such, and it really also served a second purpose that Moss pointed out to me, which was to kind of conceal that this was a woman. Maybe not, maybe because again, the guys wouldn't wear this bonnet, right? But to keep them protected from sexual harassment in the fields as well. And that actually is a piece of Shizuko's story in his book. So I did research like this, and that became the first sketch on this side. And again, I felt akin to those 100-year-old grapevines, So the Masumoto farms and the stone peaches and nectarines and apricots are so beautiful and so delicious and so celebrated, but to me, the raisin and the grapevines have a sort of long-term generational strength that really runs through the valley. My family did raisins for generations. So I really wanted to honor the raisins. And it turns out the Masumotos have a beautiful piece of stained glass of grapevines by their house. So I was really inspired. Shizuko had to be surrounded by grapevines in my mind. And because she was in her late teens, early 20s when she was separated from the family, I tried to imagine Shizuko as beautiful as she possibly could be. So that went from the sketch, and I think I showed it to Tomas and said, does this look okay? And then it became the sketch. That was actually drawn onto the linoleum block, which became this carving, which became the print. And I did bring for you guys to see the block. And Moss was asking me earlier, how many tries did you do? I said I did it in one. Because if I mess it up, I do have to do the whole thing again. But that's nothing serious, right? You know. And then it was hand watercolored, so all the color that went into the cover was hand watercolored. And that's what the cover looked like in the end. We just had a great big opening in Fresno for the book 2 weeks ago. And the gallery owners had this brilliant idea of blowing it up like that, so you could really see Shizuko. But I felt like it was a way to honor her by making her the center of that story when she couldn't even tell the story herself, and to give her that kind of vibrancy that she deserved. So I think that's my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. It was a joy working with Patricia, and one of the things I wanted to do was respect her as an artist. So I never gave her an idea of what she should do. I did trick her, though, as she said, that I thought in the beginning it'd just be like 3 or 4 drawings, and they ended up being over 30. But that's okay. It's just like I wanted to share with you that this book went through 65 drafts. And it was necessary to go through each one because each one got better. There's someone here in the audience, actually, that saw an early draft. And I'm almost embarrassed that she saw it, and I asked her to burn it, but she wouldn't. But it did show how projects like this evolve through work, and evolve through thought, and evolve through time, as they should, because family stories are just like that. They evolve. We create different aspects and add something else to that family story. That's how memory is created too. We add to our memories. For example, when I first met Shizuko, I thought this was going to be this, momentous time. She had been comatose. The caregivers were amazing. She wasn't in an ICU unit or any other kind of specialized care. She was in a basic nursing home assisted care center. But they found a way to nurse her back to life. And after 3 months, she woke up. That's when I went to go meet her the first time. And when I walked in to meet her, first of all, one of the staffers said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Shizuko's nephew." And he looked at me and he says, "Where have you been?" And he was exactly right. Because in many ways, they were her family. We were strangers that we were first meeting her. So I go up to meet her for the first time. She's in a wheelchair at this time. And I go up to her, and the first thing she does, she kicks me. She kicks me in the leg. And I was shocked by that. And then she held her foot up because she wanted her shoe tied. And it dawned on me, this is how she survived those 7 decades. She had this feistiness, as the family told me they called her. She had this spirit. She had this energy. So as I got to know and hear more of her stories, I began to understand more of her character. For example, she loved to go around to the staff and pinch them. She would pinch, realize she's about 4'2", 80 pounds. So she'd run around, and they began to, and they love it because she'd pinch them and she'd run away giggling. So they began to develop a relationship with her. She had a spirit about her. And then they told me the story about her drinking coffee. She loved hot coffee in the morning. So she'd get this cup of coffee, sip it and drink it. A smile would come on her face, and then she'd fling the cup over her shoulder. Right? And they said, we got to change this to styrofoam cups. All right? So they changed it to styrofoam cups, and then she would continue to do that. So they realized they had to put a wall behind her so she doesn't start hitting people. But that was her character. That was her personality. She had that spirit. In a funny way, I began to realize, she's not very Japanese. I know Marie Kondo wouldn't like my Aunt Shizuko, all right? Because that was part of the spirit that she had. But one of that same spirit, to me, started resonating about how we farmed. And one of the ways that we farmed was this term, and I mentioned it in the film called wabi-sabi. It's a Japanese concept that captured the beauty of things as they were in nature. Imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. Our organic farm embodied this spirit. I later realized so does my family. Shizuko seemed to love an imperfect life to the fullest. My family seemed to find comfort when they recognized our history was bound by wrongs. But a mantra for both organic farming and people was that families were thriving with a disability. A beauty is found in the imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. And I realized that's how we farmed organically too. We did not grow perfect peaches, because perfect peaches meant on the outside they were cosmetically perfect, and we were always wanted to find the perfection in the inside of a peach. So we lived with that imperfection. We also learned to live with things being incomplete. And my wife could attest to that, because I'd start many projects and we have a huge junk pile, right? Because life is about being incomplete. But also, life is being about impermanent. And as I grow older, you'd start thinking about your own mortality. I actually think in the reverse. As I grow older, I've learned that failures are not permanent. I could move on because the failures aren't going to always be with me. So in the same spirit, I think Shizuko thrived in that kind of idea. And one of the things that I wanted to explore when I started this book was looking at basic questions we would have about family. I want all of you for a moment to stop and think, what question do you have about your family? Something that you'd want to always ask someone. Why family did something that they did? How did they accomplish or not accomplish something? Who was involved with that? So for a moment, ask yourself those kind of questions. This is how you start getting into family secrets. Not from judgment, but more from just asking questions. So think of a question, one question you would ask right now of your family. Now, I want you to try something. Turn to your friend or someone and ask them that question. I'm serious. Turn to your someone and ask them that question. Go ahead, please. I hope this exercise will trigger something in you, that you will go and ask that question of your family. And again, it doesn't mean that you're judging them. It doesn't mean that you're prying into something dark. What you're asking is you're just being curious to try to find the story that defines us. These are stories that tell who we are now, and in fact, in a fun way, it's the idea of it's the past is living in you now. Just like Sean's hard pen is part of who he is. But also, when you start asking questions, you're actually starting to build the future. You're filling in those stories before they are lost. The stories that in 10, maybe a few years, you can't find anymore because you never asked. So that's why the questions you just asked, promise me you're going to go and then follow up on that question. All right? And that's what I did in this book. And that's why I went through 65 drafts. Because I kept asking a question, sometimes finding an answer, sometimes finding more questions to that. But I think it's part of that living with ghosts. That these ghosts are out there and they actually want to talk with you. Because they want to fill your story as much as possible. Let me end with one passage that's from Secret Harvest, and I'll paraphrase it. it talks about the spirit of farming. And it talked about when a hailstorm came to our farm, and it hailed on our peaches a week before we were to pick them, and we lost the entire crop. Right? But a thunderstorm and a hailstorm, you could watch it go across the countryside, and I could map which farmer was being hit by that. So we started phoning each other because we knew who was also going through this experience. And one of the farmers said, "Hey, Mas, I got to tell you a story." And he told me this interesting story. He said they did an autopsy on an old farmer, and when they opened them up, they found they were filled with next years. And that resonated so much because that was Shizuko. She was filled with next years. That's the story of our farm and our family. We're always working with the past in the present, but thinking about next years. And I hope you and your questions will start filling those next years. Thank you very much.
So do you want to just like keep talking for another hour and then I don't have to do anything? Thank you for this hard pan. It is not only can I now remember that I'm the lazy city son of a farmer, but I can be reminded. So thank you very much. I wanna start. I mean, first of all, thank you both so much for your beautiful reflections on the process of this book and the things it brought up. I want to start by bringing in the voice of a writer named Liz Moore, who identifies as disabled. This is from the book Disability Visibility, which is edited by Alice Wong, who worked with Mas in various capacities on this book and blurbed it. And I want to bring this in because I think it's an important, as somebody who doesn't identify as disabled, I think it's important to start from folks who identify as disabled and voices of folks who identify as disabled. And she opens this essay, "I'm Tired of Chasing a Cure," with, "There is a persistent belief amongst able people that a cure is what disabled people should want. To abandon our disabled selves and bodies and assimilate into a perhaps unachievable abled skin. Pushback to this idea often comes in the form of the social model of disability, which states that we are disabled by society and lack of access rather than by our bodies." I'm going to say that again. Pushback to this idea often comes in the form of the social model of disability, which states that we are disabled by society and lack of access rather than by our bodies. For many, the social model can be liberating. By locating the cause of our problems outside our bodies, we can begin to love ourselves again. Tackling systemic ableism may feel like tilting at windmills, but it is still easier to address than some kind of failing within ourselves. What I really love about this is it sort of encapsulates something that you return back to often throughout the book, which is the reminder that it's not that Shizuko was a failure, right? I think that there's one way of reading the situation, but rather that these multiple layers of system and social pressure and social exploitation failed Shizuko. I'm curious in your process of writing this book and then in your process of reading through the book and thinking about how you're gonna represent it, how that changed the way you approach your respective crafts. I think that you sort of spoke to that a little bit. But
One of the dynamics was when I entered this project, I was very ignorant about disabilities. Right? And one of the challenges for me was the use of language, because I grew up with certain terms and I understood how those terms were used. And one of the challenges was to write this book in context of history, not to say they were using bad terms or wrong terms. For example, there's a chapter in this book where I talked about Shizuko when she first left the family in 1942. Did her people who took care of her see her as a Japanese enemy? And it dawned on me, she may have gone into the ward with other young people with Down syndromes because they looked Asian. And the term we used when we were young was being Mongoloid. A Mongoloid idiot was often the term, because it was such a racist idea that if you get Down syndrome, you begin to look Asian. The twist to that was, did that actually re-identify Shizuko not as being this enemy Japanese, but someone with Down syndrome? So these kind of stories start weaving together in the use of language. And how do you define people like that? So Alice was great to work with because I sent her an early draft, and she was wonderful. It was filled with red marks all over because she was correcting me or trying to push me to think of it in a different context. And I still am learning so much about that. But there was this notion of these parallel stories. Our family living with the disability of the faces they wore, alongside of Shizuko living with her disability. And how do we see that not as a failure, but as something that they strove to live with? Not overcome, but to live with. And that was what I started struggling with too, and trying to understand where I was in this, all of this, and try to understand the context of the past, but also how that sense of the language that we use is affecting me today.
I think my response will be pretty short, but it's a great question, Char. I hadn't thought about this in terms of the illustrated pieces of it, but I think that overall, I approach this with this idea of making Shizuko visible. And even though I didn't have images of her when she was a child, in fact, if I ever did this project over again, I would start with the older images and really build a character. And I didn't do that. I just kind of started doing some drawings.
Well, maybe you should redo them.
Okay.
This for the second edition.
Yeah, so anyway, it is true though, like part of it was not about, and I didn't consciously do this, was to make her wholly, totally vibrant. Like that was something that I wanted throughout, and it never became a question of, oh, this is when she was like this and this and this and this, right? I don't know. Every single image that I did create that represents Shizuko at some point of her life is appropriate to Shizuko at that age. And I also think that the parts where Mas meets Shizuko, it was focused on her caretakers, it was focused on compassion, it was focused mostly on touch. There's one where she's sitting in a wheelchair by herself, but there's a light behind her, there's a window of hope. So I'm gonna stop right there, but I just will say that I didn't try to
Sean, how do you think of use of language in the work that you do?
Try, not fail often, but try. Well, I mean, I think I love that, Moss, you're throwing this back at me when I'm supposed to. I was just gonna sit back and ask my questions. I mean, I think we are in a moment where precision of language is allowing for people to find liberation and freedom. I think people are able to define themselves, and I think that means taking power back. And so I think often, because with language comes power. And so I think that it's beautiful that we are in a moment when writers like Alice are able to, that you're able to speak with someone like Alice who's able to talk you through, well, here are some ways of thinking about and talking about disability that may be different than the way that the mainstream, quote unquote, and I use that very, very lightly, would think about it. And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot there in terms of what the responsibility of the writer is and what the impact of those words are. And I do want to go back to, Patricia, something you were saying, and I think I love the way that you articulated that, because it really dovetails with the question I had. A major theme in the book is visibility. So on page 187, you open the chapter, and the chapter is titled "Farming is a Radical Act." You open with, "Throughout our family history, farming made life visible." I'm wondering, Patricia, I'd love to hear how what you chose to make visible. There are so many of these images throughout that are not just Shizuko. Mas, I'd love to hear what it was like to see such quiet, personal moments represented through a very, I think the process of printmaking is very intimate, even more so than some other disciplines. So curious to hear about how you chose what to bring to life, and then Moss, sort of what your reaction was to seeing them on page.
Right. Well, I'll start by saying, like, what Moss also introduces, that he gave me full freedom, and there was evolution that happened throughout the process of it. So maybe there was an illustration that didn't quite work, But I would start from the beginning and read everything through and just write down what was the most obvious image that worked with this. Like, it seemed like the accompanying symbol that worked well. But there were a couple that I got stumped on. I mean, farming as a radical act is a really good example because it's the girl laying under the trees with her arms up, which, by the way,
It's a beautiful image, by the way.
well,
that really,
okay, right here. It was my homage to Nikiko because I always thought of Nikiko laying down in the orchard doing that.
Nikiko
so anyway,
is
that's
Mas's daughter.
Mas's daughter. But there were other ones. Like, I like to use redress as the example chapter because there's a whole chapter on redress, and it's like, what do you do? I mean, you don't necessarily need to have the CWRC and someone like sitting and like giving testimony, and it's not. We've seen that photograph, but what else can you do to expand upon that? So one of the images that was in the slideshow was the person harvesting the grapes, which is, directly from a photograph that I took of Moss. And to me, that symbolized it enough, like that it was this feeling that you're now taking this in. Like, it takes a lot of work. There were so many generations to build us up to that one point to the harvest, right? And it wasn't the full harvest, but it was a tough harvest, and it's going to keep regenerating too. So that's a pretty weak response to your question because it was hard.
Great.
It was hard in a lot of cases. What's the right image to go? And it's my first time I did a full-length book too, with this many images in a series. Any thoughts about that too, Moss?
Again, realize, I don't know how novelists work. My sense is that they start with a concept and then they just start following a character and it grows. Right? In a way, I did that, except I couldn't make things up. And most of the time, I ran into nothing. There were no photographs. There's no stories, no artifacts around. And I tried to dig it more, and then you hit roadblocks, right? Because as I mentioned in the film, she became a ward of the state. So the family was no longer responsible and didn't have access to her records. Right? So does that mean she didn't exist? No. So how do you try to capture that? And how do you try to work around that and acknowledge that reality at the same time? It's no different than when my parents came back from the camps. My grandmother had a type of trauma, and it's a generational trauma that I inherited. I distinctly remember two scenes very quickly. This is on the Masumoto side. When my dad bought the farm, he went home and they were living in this shack on some rented land, and he tells his parents, I bought a farm. And my grandmother was furious. And she said, you made a mistake because in America, they take things away. And she was absolutely right. So they got so my grandfather said, this is great. So he went in the car and ready to go to the new farm. My dad said, we're gonna wait in the car until the sun sets, and then we're going to go to the new Masumoto farm. The sun set, my grandmother came out carrying the suitcase with the stenciled number of the family, a black suitcase. They got in the car and they drove to the new farm in silence. And that captured that idea of the visibility and the invisibility of things of that sort. Also later in life, and I write about this in Secret Harvest, there were moments when my grandmother just exploded with emotion. Just yelling, screaming, stamping her feet, and this is this quiet little lady stamping her feet, weeping. And I was witnessing this, and my dad was watch her go through this, and then she would then calm down, they'd sit together, and it was the only time I saw my dad put his arm around my grandmother, and they just sat in silence. And to me, I was beginning to understand the trauma that they went through.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there about just like the way that families survived and what it meant to sacrifice and what sacrifice looked like, but also just how women didn't have a lot of choice in the matter for these family decisions, and it really affected. I know we were just having a very quick sidebar about that, about how that question of what regrets do my grandmothers have as like the wife of a farmer. So you learn about Shizuko February 2012. You get the call. A year and a half later, she passes away. Can you talk a little bit about your emotional journey and sort of what for you was like to get to know somebody so quickly and sort of have to process grief and love and reunion and all these things at once.
One of the dynamics, both maybe being a writer, but also someone who loves story, is stories don't end. All right. Shizuko woke up, lived for another year and a half, went to go visit her. Obviously, she didn't recognize me. We did not communicate other than I would help her go through up and down the hallways of her assisted care center. She passes, and it's not the end of the story, because it was really just the beginning of me trying to piece some of this together. And that was, on the one hand, the journey of a writer, but it's also the journey of family, because I would pull in my cousins, my uncle and aunt, and ask them some questions too. So, and some family members are here that they will think back and he's saying, what's he trying to do? Right? But it's because you ask questions, and that solidifies the bond of family. It's not that you do this token thing where you go to maybe a memorial service and we're family. No, it's asking hard questions, sometimes laughing about it, sometimes understanding when someone doesn't want to say anything, and respect the fact that they want to forget. And that's so valuable, because that's all what makes family so much. So that's why the journey continues, and it continues today. Just ran into a gentleman who starts talking to me because he knows I was doing research. Backstory, there's the butsudan that my grandfather had crafted. One of the questions is, what do they do with these 3-foot wonderful butsudans during the war? They found an Armenian neighbor who was being willing to store these pagan religious items and store them for their good neighbor. And it wasn't an accident. I believe it was an Armenian, because they had gone through genocide. They understood how things get torn from you. So after the war, I credit my uncles for having the strength to go claim that piece of history. And that piece of history is still alive. It's in my daughter's house and in my cousin's house too. It's part of that. It was that moment, right, where the story continues. And it's the story of that resilience, of that strength, but also that understanding the dynamic of what do we need to save. And they saved this altar, a Buddhist altar in a Christian world, a pagan altar taken care of by Christians who understood, though, the trauma of life. That adds another layer to the story.
I think that those layers are really beautifully explored in this piece, which is such a great archive of memory. And I'm very excited for everyone in the audience to read it. We have about another 5 minutes, and then we are going to have a Q&A, so please get those questions ready. I suspect it's going to be a bit of a bloodbath getting your question in, so make sure you have it ready to go in concise sentences.
Let me ask you, Sean. All right. We talked about family secrets. Okay. Sean,
where are we going?
Do you want to share a question you've had about your family?
Which one? Where to start? I think, the one that I said to Patricia earlier was just the question of, what do my grandmothers regret? I think that there are the narrative of a perfect family where everybody makes a decision and then you go with it, and then that's like the family legacy is a really beautiful one to pass on and make people proud of, but where's the honesty in that? And I am curious, my grandmother lived, my Fresno grandmother who raised 3 kids and farmed a few miles away from the Masumoto farm, and then lived on the Masumoto farm for 6 months. She had a very, very hard life that I don't know whether that was something that she opted into. On my mother's side, my grandmother was very much in the shadow of my grandfather, but then sort of went off and got a PhD in her late 50s and became an educator, and had her own, has an incredible legacy that we just don't talk about as much because she's under the shadow of my grandfather. So I think that there are questions there that I have, and I don't know if there's so much family secrets as much as things that are not spoken about unless the question's asked.
Well, what I also countered immediately to Sean, though, what options did they have?
Right.
What choices did they
Right.
have? So to have that regret means that you've actually had the space and the freedom to think about,
Right.
oh, these are things I wish I hadn't done. And you need that other part of knowing what your choices might be.
Yeah. Definitely.
In throughout Secret Harvest, every chapter ends with this idea of the Japanese term is shikataganai. It can't be helped. And when I started the book, and when I began the first part of the book, it was, well, what does that mean? It can't be helped. It means like, okay, I guess I'm powerless to do anything. Or what's the deeper meaning of that? Does it mean that, no, I understand where I am, and that's the power that I have to accept where I am, because I can't change things? Or does it mean at a certain point, no, it's about like wabi-sabi, that life goes on, things are impermanent, so it can't be helped means that I'm going to go to the next step. So there's all that rush of emotions of trying to understand what that means, and such a common term in almost all of our families. And that's where that idea of language that comes in with all these different meanings. And it made me think, okay, so I think of shigata-ganai, it can't be helped, one way. What does Nikiko and Cory, our children, what do they think of shigata-ganai? Now I'm sure some of them, when they messed up, they would say, hey, let's just tell Dad shigata-ganai. And they'd be forgiven, But what's the depth of that? And what's that kind of legacy that means with it? And my wife, Marcy, who has Wisconsin German roots, what was the German word for shigata-ganai? It can't be helped. And my conclusion was, no, they said, we're going to control everything.
Light language, careful. Yeah, I should have tried shigata-ganai with my hard ass dad. So we're coming to the end of this conversation. There's going to be a lot more in the lobby after the Q&A. But just to close this out, what do you want readers to walk away from the book with in terms of questions or things that they're mulling over? What do you want them to immediately turn to their partner and ask? Or
Yeah, I think the first thing is they start asking questions about their own family. Because one of the themes of the book is every family has secrets. And it doesn't mean these dark, ugly, bad secrets. It's every family has secrets. So let's explore those.
Patricia?
I'll keep it short because I was a reader, really. I just read his book and followed his lead. It was like a dance. But I feel like...
But I want to interject, though, because Patricia's artwork really brings a certain tangibility to the story that I think otherwise, I think Moss's beautiful words, they're really brought to life by your work. So please, don't downplay yourself.
Thanks,
No Indio. We don't do that anymore.
I won't. I'm taught. It has something to do, again, with those other layers of the impact of EO 9066. So I mentioned it in the meet and greet, but I didn't say it here, is that I learned so much to think about things like the mental health issue, both with his bachan and with his uncle, who was a 442 veteran, and we don't see behind the scenes that there's the fighting, and then there's the accolades, or the complexities of the community, but you don't see the angry veteran part towards the end that might be struggling with the decisions or the fate or just everything, because the uncle that's discussed in the story has injuries that he sustains from fighting in the war, and of course there were so many pieces to that. And so those kinds of impacts and those kinds of residues of EO 9066 are things I would really like people to think about, and honestly about what happened to the people who aren't talked about, the people who are completely hidden from the stories up till now.
I think those are really beautiful takeaways. So with that, we're going to transition into the Q&A. Elizabeth is going to run around with a microphone. Please treat them with lots of respect. I also want to say there's going to be time after this to speak with Patricia and Mas in the hall afterwards. There's going to be time to give any compliments or to talk through anything else you want to with them at that time. So let's ask questions in this moment and then have great conversation in the lobby. So feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. Elizabeth over there.
Were any of the siblings of your aunt, did they know that you found her, and did they ever had the chance to meet them before their passing?
Oh, my aunt and uncle, my mom were still alive at that point. My mom passed away. They were fantastic. They were stunning in their strength to try to come to grips with this story. And all these emotions had to be passing through them. Emotions of finding their sister, but also the guilt, the shame, the trauma of history, all that was impacting them. And they were fantastic in that they wanted to try to have closure on this. And actually, though, at the same time, I believe opened the door for these other questions to be answered. And again, they're to me, it's part of those ancestors, living ancestors, that define who I am. Thank you.
I think your comments about the power of language are very important, especially considering yesterday the LA Times has announced it will not use the term internment camps anymore. And when you talk about the disabled, and I like the term differently abled because you described your aunt, who was a wonderfully mischievous sprite personality. When you talk about having these conversations with your family, as soon as you say secret, it's something you don't want to divulge, which is why it's a secret. Do you think it might be better to say, are there questions that have been left unasked?
Yes. You're absolutely right.
Easy. All right, any other questions? I think we have one over here and one over here. So we can go over there first and then, yes.
Thank you. Yeah, for Patricia, ever since I saw the slide with the tool that you were talking about for separating the grapes from the vine, and then thinking about your medium, where you're also separating material, just kind of harvest your image. I was wondering if, when you were going through that process, if you made that connection.
Never.
What you thought of it. Well, you're welcome.
That's awesome. That's great. No, you're right though. It's a sharp, hard tool to separate it from the material. Thanks.
All right, we're moving over.
One of the things that I loved about Patricia's artwork was it goes back to that traditional Japanese woodblock prints, and then I love that idea because one of the strengths, I think, of it is it's not just done once. You do it and you could make prints that you could share. And to me, that's what art, that's what writing is about. It's not making this one-time thing, it's about sharing.
All right, I think we have a question up here.
Hi, I just wanted to say that I'm really honored to be here. My in-laws lived in Fresno years ago and they're both gone, but I read your column all the time and I think you're an amazing writer and I love your feel for nature, basically. But I had a question that's not really germane to the book, but I wanted to ask you, what did happen to Alberta peaches? Why are they gone? Where did they go? I mean, they used to come in the can when I was a child. I mean, I grew up in California, you could always get Alberta peaches. And now it's all cling peaches, and they're kind of tasteless. And I mean, especially the ones in the can. I know you can get some fresh, but where are the Albertas? I know you're supposed to have some, right?
That's a great question because when you start thinking, she's asking about the Alberta peach, which was the standard peach for many, many years, and it's been replaced because there's been newer peaches that evolved that weren't as good flavor, but were bigger and redder and more uniform and had shelf life for grocery stores. Right? And it's amazing to think about that because what happens when something like a peach evolves? Does the farm and the farmer change and evolve with it? And the answer is yes. Farming has changed once Albertas were grown. Farmers have had to change. Families had to change with that. And so in a way, it actually is part of the Shizako story about things changing and evolving over time. And to answer your question specifically, very few people grow Albertas. We do. And we do it because part of my stubbornness of wanting to maintain something that has a value like an heirloom, a value like a story. And that's how I perceive the work that we do. And we found some homes for the Albertas too. And then there's a few people in the audience who have shared and come to our farm, because we do an Adopt a Peach every year, and they know, raise your hands, you know what an Alberta tastes like. You know, thank you, because you have saved not only the Alberta, but you're saving a family, a farm, and a story.
Well,
Right? And this story could be alive too. So
well, thank you. I'll get membership in your farm.
Absolutely. First, my next question, but you don't have to answer is, well, why did your family leave Fresno? But that's okay. So.
We didn't, I think a lot of you may be here because you are familiar with the Masumoto peach. Raise your hand if you've had a Masumoto peach before. If your hand is not raised, I highly recommend you figure out how you're going to do that this summer, because it's a life-changing experience. All right, I think we have a question up here.
Where can we buy the Masumoto peach in Southern California and any other of your products?
Check is in the mail.
We sell a lot into the LA area. There's some restaurants and distributors. The simplest way is we formed a relationship with Tanaka Farms down in Riverside and Irvine, and then they get some directly from us, and they sell it, and they were wonderful to work with. It all started in the middle of the pandemic, because we had talked about trying to sell something to them. The pandemic hit. Is this going to work? It turned out to be fantastic. Because one of the side stories of something like a pandemic where people were at home, food became something that they started eating together. You weren't necessarily going to restaurants. People weren't, teenagers weren't running off. You were having family meals. And at that time, food began to occupy a different strata and meaning in our life. And to me, I love that, because with that, you begin to ask a question. And the question is, where does this food come from? Who grows it? What's the story behind the food? And that's what, to me, completes the whole story. That's the complete flavor of a peach, of a nectarine, of an apricot, of a raisin, is the idea that it's the whole story you understand, and it's filling your body and your soul at the same time.
I'll also offer that my favorite way of doing it is just committing to driving the 4 hours up to Fresno. No, like, I'm serious. It's a fun enough road trip. You can go off to like Santa Barbara for a second and then get up there, because they do have the Adopt a Tree program, and then they also have the fabulously, what's the drive-through? Fabulously ugly. Yes, UFAB. Oh, UFAB. They're great. Question?
Hey, Mas. I just wanted to congratulate you, not necessarily on the book, but on being a grandfather now. So I want to know what's that process been like? I know you talk about being out in the fields with the ghosts of your ancestors, and now you have this addition to this family tree.
One of the amazing things is, and I hadn't thought about it until she was born, and the name of our granddaughter is Nunziata. It's an Italian name because Nikiko's partner is Italian background. So her name is Nunziata Masumoto, Italian and Japanese. And I gotta tell you, her middle name is Dynamite. So it's Nunziata Dynamite Masumoto. And part of it was the dynamite that my father had to use to break up the hard pan, But the key thing with that, Jeff, was the idea that it hit me that as Nunziata grows, she's going to be walking these fields with me. Another generation is going to be walking these fields. I have no idea if she'll stay on the farm, but at least for her youth, to a certain age, she will walk the same fields with me. And it changed the timeline. It changed how I look at a farm through a very, very different lens. And as a side note, one of the things that was wonderful working with Nikiko, our daughter, is we have written a children's book that will be published in the 2025. And the name of the children's book, and we're working with an illustrator right now, the name of the book is Every Peach is a Story. And it's about generations on the farm, and Nunziata is part of that. Thank you, Jeff.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions, maybe. I think we have one over here, and then we have a couple.
Don't worry, I'm not gonna ask you a question, Maz. I'll ask you that later. So I am one of the family members of the Sugimoto family, and very fortunate to be part of this amazing family. So I wanted to say something about sort of our journey through this process, because Moss had called me originally, respecting my father's feelings about perhaps bringing to light something that may be not easy to bring to light. And I've talked to him about this. And you know, back then, and I just want to make sure we all understand, when you have a family member that is other abled, that during those times it was not necessarily looked upon with great favor by the community. It often reflected possibly something that wasn't right with the family, perhaps a punishment for something. And so when I talked to him, he explained to me how it became very difficult for family members. And not saying that there was necessarily anything wrong with the family, but how the community viewed that, as we've already talked about. It's not about what the person is, but what we in the society create because of that. So he was telling me that when they were incarcerated, that it was probably very fortunate that she was made a ward of the state. And unfortunately, my impression of that was, wow, you know, how insensitive that would have been. And yet listening to your discussion about potentially her being in an environment where people may have seen her as the same as everyone else made me think twice about maybe it was. And not just for the family being taken away and put into a camp with every other Japanese American and Japanese, but just that the fact that she may have been cared for better. He even said something to me that it would have been probably nicer for her to have had that kind of care back when. And of course we knew that they couldn't afford that, which is why she didn't get the medical care. So I have a whole different perspective now, given what he has told me and given what you've said, and really appreciate and honor the fact that his story is his story and that he was willing to share it with me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, because it's that dynamic that this isn't a made-for-TV movie, right, where there's good guys and bad guys, or it's going to have a happy ending or a tragic ending. It's life, which is filled with all these emotions, and the emotions continue to evolve. So thank you, Lisa.
I just want to add that I would like to thank Patricia for making Sugi a cover girl.
I can't think of a better way to end the afternoon. I know that there's some other questions lingering, but that's where the lobby will be an incredible place to have some nice conversation. Secret Harvest is out right now from Red Hen Press. They are available for sale in the lobby. Please stop by, talk to Moss and Patricia. Any last words before we close this afternoon?
I just want to thank you, thank Sean, thank Patricia, thank Elizabeth and the museum for hosting this, because it becomes a forum and an opportunity to share stories.
Thank you all very much.